So, in my whole life, I've been reading manga. Few have really left an impression on me. And this particular manga that shook me, that I've read a couple of times over every few years. I'm talking about Goodnight Punpun. Now, I'm sure if you've been on YouTube, a lot of the times you might have seen this manga be mentioned, but I wanted to put in my little take on it. And things do get seriously dark and grimy up here, so if you are triggered by topics on depression, anxiety, abuse, and anything of the like, then do click away. Okay, if you're still here, let's get into it. So, Goodnight Punpun is a coming of age story, but it's not afraid to get real at all. And we go through some pretty depressing events. So Punpun is obviously not this guy's real name. By the way, Punpun is an onomatopoeic word. Okay, I usually have to say that word very slowly because it's hard to pronounce. An onomatopoeic word in Japanese that describes the state of being brooding or upset. And I guess to connect this to the story, it has to do with, the whole angsty feeling throughout this manga. So Punpun's story starts off as a young boy who is idealistic and has tons of fantastical dreams and goals, which, is what most children would be like. And as we read the story, though, things slowly change and things only get worse, really. There's rarely a time where you can kind of breathe a sigh of relief. It only seems like things just progressively get worse as he gets older. We get a look into Punpun's mentality when he meets a new girl, Aiko, in class. And, he talks with her and is blown away by the town Nerima that she moved from. And it just really highlights how innocent he is. And we're all like that when we're younger. We just have everything's a whole new world. And he does come back home and his parents are fighting, which to him is just a normal occurrence, and he just goes off to his room and is talking to a person named God. So obviously this is some figment of imagination that is from his mind. And from what I've read, God seems to be Punpun's dark side, or more specifically his more self-destructive, impulsive desires. So I guess if you're familiar with Freud, it's what I'd imagine a personification of the id would be. And this God only ever pretty much offers the worst advice ever, or just simply says, I don't know. So thankfully he doesn't really take that, his advice with a grain of salt most of the time. So yeah. Later, Punpun's mother does end up in the hospital, and obviously we know what happened and who actually did it, and it looks like Punpun knows as well. And I'm not going to go over every single event that happens in this manga, but Punpun essentially goes through every traumatic event that can happen to a person, and it is really depressing. But I remember the first time I read this manga, I just couldn't put it down. It doesn't help that almost every character in this manga has some serious issues and mental problems. So that kind of all comes together into one big mess that you just can't, take your eyes away from. And I can really connect with this. Growing up, you basically slowly take off this veil of illusion off of your whole perception of things. As children, we kind of have our idealistic view of what our current world, how our family and friends are, and really a mostly positive outlook on everything. But as we grow up, we kind of realize things just aren't really what they were. And this disillusionment is a part of growing up, but realizing, the full truth of certain matters can be really disheartening, and losing that prior innocence and positivity you might have had as a child is not exactly the most happiest kind of thing you could go through. But it's kind of just all a part of growing up. And this manga does a great job of illustrating that process and what it does to a person. And, people always say things were so simple back then. And I agree, things were simple, and we believed that, whatever we wanted to believe or what we were told from others. But, we just grow up and realize things weren't actually like that, and the truth is actually different. People, your parents, family, friends, relatives might lie about certain things and cover up the less ideal side of things. Now, Punpun has it really rough though, and things just get compounded upon with just so many people in this manga have such big problems. There's people in cults and, domestic violence, all of that. But yeah, everybody around Punpun has some serious issues. And, for example, his mother, even though she was a horrible mother to Punpun, I can't help but feel bad for her. And it just really feels like every person has the worst luck ever. But when you do kind of think about it retrospectively, it is really just the result of one thing after the other. One bad decision, a wrong thought that is executed. So it's not like the characters are completely innocent. And victims shouldn't create more victims, right? But that's easier said than done. I'm not too sure why Punpun and his family members, his mom, dad, and uncle, are illustrated as cartoonish birds though. One thing I thought of was that it's maybe for like the shock factor, where there's a gap between, the cute bird design and the dark issues the manga illustrates. But I think it's to illustrate Punpun's own perception. His family's members are all illustrated as birds because that's his family that he's most familiar with. The bird design changes according to his mental state throughout the manga, so I'm guessing it's the most raw design. In the way that Punpun is the most familiar with his family members and their mentality, he is able to see them for who they truly are, and thus they are birds, unlike other people outside his family who are illustrated as people, people who he's not really truly familiar with their true selves. I don't know if I even describe that in a way that anyone would be able to understand, but yeah, that was just my take. Now things only get worse for Punpun, and while once shy, he turns to isolating himself from others, both physically and mentally. This goes towards a steep downward spiral, and so much crazy stuff happens that I won't spoil it. But yeah, it is a whole storm. But he does make a decent recovery at the end and manages to live on, even with all the trauma and mental baggage he's carried. He finds a way to live, and it's becomes a hopeful message at the end. And just a side thought, which might be a plot hole, but I'm wondering, with the things Punpun did, why didn't he end up in jail? And seeing how things ended, I guess he could have been in jail for a couple of years, but I'm pretty sure he should have been in there longer. But I guess I am happy to see Punpun get a somewhat happy ending. It's not exactly like the most happiest ending ever, but I think it is pretty realistic. But I digress. I do like the very ending, which echoes the first chapter. I guess it is in a way to say that this whole story and all of these kinds of events that happen to a Punpun isn't only applicable to this character or this story. It can just really happen to anyone, but just know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and no matter how dire or dim things get, there's always a possibility of a happy ending. And despite any of the bad things that happened in the past, we can somehow find the will to live on, with a good support group, hopefully. And these traumatic events may live on in our memories and may blink into our thoughts sometimes, but no one lives a perfect life, and we can only really do the best with what we have and find people, or be your own person who can support yourself in being your best self. And I think that's a realization that we all kind of make at some point in our lives. But Punpun, this story does it in a very raw way where it's something. It's hard to describe what this manga is. Also, what is it with these dark coming of age stories where the main character ends up with a random girl that gets introduced like way later in the story, like in The Flowers of Evil or in Evangelion? But I guess that was a different canon. But man, I don't know. Well, actually, I do know. I guess it's just part of the motif of moving on. Everyone has their own mental baggage and issues, so the main character ends up moving on and being with someone else who is in a much better mental state. And honestly, that whole thing kind of puts me off in a bad way, but I can understand it. All in all, I do wish the best for everyone, every person, including you, the viewer watching this video. And so that's all I wanted to say in this video. Bye.